evening once again, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our news bulletin for tonight, to be presented jointly by Bassem Bagdash and Rashid Haidar. Our people in Syria and Egypt are preparing for commemorating the 40th anniversary of the October Liberation War, which is considered a luminous landmark in the history of modern Syria. On October the 6th, 1973, the Syrian and Egyptian armies achieved a landslide victory against the Israeli enemy. The victory inaugurated the dawn of a new era and created a promising turning point in the life of the Arab nation. This sweeping victory had great consequences at the local and international levels. Inspired by the sublime values and great meanings of the October victory, the Syrian people and army are determined to press ahead with their battle to uproot terrorism and restore security and stability to Syria. The Kremlin has expressed regret that the Russian-US meeting between both countries' presidents, which was supposed to take place in Indonesia on October the 7th, will not happen. The meeting, which was expected to take place on the sidelines of the forthcoming Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in the Indonesian city of Bali, seemed to have been cancelled after US President Barack Obama called off his tour to Asia over unresolved crisis of the budget of the US. Russia Today website quoted the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov as saying on Friday, "We are familiar with the developments and hope that they will be settled. We wait for other opportunities to hold a bilateral summit." He pointed out that the bilateral relations between Russia and the US need a high-level dialogue, noting that there are many issues on the agenda of the bilateral relations, foremost among which is the Syrian issue. Russian President's assistant Yuri Oshkov had earlier told reporters that preparations were underway to hold a meeting between Obama and Russian President Vladimir Putin on the sidelines of the summit in Bali. Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif has stressed Iran's readiness to continue cooperation that is aimed at reaching a political solution to the crisis in Syria. The Iranian News TV said Zarif called during a recent meeting with the UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon upon the UN to play an essential role in settling the regional crisis, security issues and international challenges. Zarif warned during the talks, which took place on the sidelines of the 68th UN General Assembly, against the dangers of the extremist groups in Syria possessing chemical weapons, calling for collective efforts for the removal of the chemical weapons. Ki-moon, on his part, stressed that Iran can play a vital and important role in solving the crisis in Syria. Meanwhile, Iranian ambassador in Lebanon, Ghadafar Abadi, hailed the efforts which Iran has made in avoiding the war threatened by the US against Syria, stressing that Tehran does not accept any country's intervention in the internal affairs of another country. Basim?
Thank you, Rashid. Units of the armed forces have carried out operations against terrorists' dens and gatherings in several areas, killing and injuring many of them, in addition to destroying their weapons, ammunition and vehicles in different provinces. Details are in this following report.
Units of the armed forces have carried out operations against terrorist dens and gatherings in several areas, killing and injuring many of them, in addition to destroying their weapons, ammunition and vehicles in different provinces. In Homs countryside, army units targeted and destroyed terrorist gatherings in many areas. The army also clashed with terrorists in the neighborhoods of Jurat al-Shayyah, al-Qusur, al-Qarabis and Wadi Saih in Homs city and killed scores of them. In Idlib, the army units dismantled 2 explosive devices planted by terrorists on the highway of Idlib al-Masuma and targeted and destroyed many terrorist hideouts and gatherings in many areas there. A military source told Sana that an army unit targeted terrorist gatherings in Saraqib city, killing and injuring numbers of terrorists and destroying their weapons loaded with vehicles. A unit of the armed forces has meanwhile clashed with an armed terrorist group's members who were attempting to infiltrate from the Lebanese lands to Talkalakh countryside countryside in Homs, inflicting heavy losses upon them. A military source told SANA that an army unit in cooperation with the border guards repelled an armed terrorist group's members while they were attempting to sneak into Syria through Al-Muthawama side, killing and injuring most of them in addition to destroying their weapons and ammunition. In Damascus and its countrysides, units of the armed forces achieved advancement in Berza neighborhood in the city and killed scores of terrorists, some of them affiliated to Jabhat al-Nusra in several villages and towns. An official source told SANA that the army units clashed with terrorists to the west of Syrian educational channels building in Berza neighborhood and controlled a number of buildings after killing all terrorists stationed inside them. In Aleppo, a military source told SANA that the army units fought terrorist attempts to sneak into the safe areas in Salah ad-Din neighborhood from Al-Qadur Street in Aleppo city and killed 7 terrorists, while other army units foiled terrorist attempts to sneak into the vegetable markets in Al-Ashrafiyah neighborhood, inflicting heavy losses upon them. And in Al-Hasaka countryside, an army unit targeted a gathering for Jabhat al-Nusra terrorists in the town of Al-Shadida, eliminating a number of them, inflicting or including 2 Iraqis and a Tunisian and injuring others.
The Russian Foreign Ministry affirmed in a statement that the jihadist groups fighting in Syria are linked to international terrorism and are prepared to continue murdering and destroying not just in Syria but in other countries. The statement said that Moscow had warned of such a scenario resulting from developments in Syria, noting that extremist terrorists and jihadist groups within the armed opposition control the majority of support provided to militants, including weapons. On a related issue, Russian diplomatic sources said that the chemical weapons attack in Damascus suburbs was done by a Saudi black operations team. Russia Today website quoted one of the sources as saying that based on the data from a number of sources, a picture can be assembled together. The criminal provocation in eastern Ghouta was done by a black team that the Saudis sent through Jordan and which acted with support of the so-called Liwa al-Islam group. Meanwhile, Viktor Ivanov, chief of the Russian Federal Drug Control Service, warns that armed groups from Syria could start infiltrating into the Caucasus region. He added that the Russian experts are predicting that foreign mercenaries in Syria who have been structured into paramilitary groups competing with each other will swarm towards the Caucasus. Members of the Syrian community in Russia have reiterated full support of motherland Syria and their leadership, highly appreciating the Syrian army in confronting terrorists across the country. During a meeting yesterday with the Syrian ambassador to Russia, Dr. Riyad Haddad, the members expressed pride in the heroic deeds of the Syrian army and their sacrifices to preserve Syria's sovereignty and independence. They also affirmed that they are ready to launch a campaign to raise aid needed by the Syrian people who are suffering the woes of a global war by international terrorism and its patrons. Ambassador Haddad, on his part, said he was proud to meet the Syrian community members. Back to you, Rashid.
Thank you very much, Bassem. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry has warned that the current financial crisis in the U.S. is might weaken the position of the U.S. worldwide. In a press conference on the eve of the APEC Summit for Economic Cooperation in Asia and the Pacific, to be held in Bali Islands, Indonesia, Kerry said that if the shutdown continues or witnessed again, people would start to cast doubts over the will of the U.S. to go on. It is to be noted that U.S. President Barack Obama has cancelled a tour scheduled to Asia, which made many observers to think that it would pave the way for giant economic powers in Eastern Asia, on the top of which is China, to play a bigger role on the political and economic levels and to create new balances that would have impact on the world arena. The Israeli enemy has renewed its violation of the Lebanese sovereignty in South Lebanon by a hostile reconnaissance plane. The enemy has lately condensed violating the Lebanese sovereignty by air and land and sea in a continuous breach of the international resolutions, particularly number 1701. Israeli military ships have recently violated the Lebanese territorial waters and overflights as the border Lebanese town of Kfar Kalla in South Lebanon witnessed yesterday a huge deployment of the Israeli vehicles and troops in the Basatin and near the wall separating Palestine at Fatma Gate to carry out maneuvering drills. The series of the Israeli soldiers' movement was a form of provocation against the Lebanese side, the most important of which was when some Israeli soldiers climbed the 7-meter cement wall to take photos of the Lebanese army border post at the gate, which made the Lebanese army units deploy soldiers to patrol the area. More news of the past.
Thank you very much, Rashid. Egyptian security bodies have decided to seal off the Tahrir Square and Al-Ittihadiyya Palace vicinity in Cairo in front of the traffic till next Monday morning until the celebrations of the 40th anniversary of the October War are over. The security and policemen who are entitled to secure vital public institutions are permitted to use live bullets against any attempts to assault or storm these sites, particularly after reporting that the third rank of the Muslim Brotherhood elements have convened to arrange for rioting and disrupting peace during the coming festivities. The so-called Legitimacy Support Coalition affiliated to the banned Muslim Brotherhood Party supporting the ousted President Mohammed Morsi had earlier called for demonstrations next Friday through Sunday in an attempt to spoil the Egyptian people's celebrations of the historical victory of the October War. 4 people had earlier been reported killed and 40 others wounded in clashes evoked by pro-Brotherhood elements in response to the calls of the Brotherhood Coalition, as they also tried to storm Al-Tahrir Square and some other places where there were some gatherings demonstrating in support of the army and in rejection of terrorism. The security men, however, were able to confront the rioters and prevented them from entering the square. Higher Consultant of the General Commander of the Iranian Armed Forces, Major General Sayyid Yahya Safawi, has asserted that the power and range of power in the world are shifting from America and Europe towards the Asian continent due to the current circumstances of the region. Safawi added in a statement today that the Asian power comprising China, India, Russia and Japan will constitute the superpowers structure in the 21st century, and that Iran has to enhance its overall relations with these powers to be able to resist the unjust American and European Union embargo and overcome it. Safawi asserted that the Americans and the Zionists bear old hostility towards Iran, and that the carrot-stick policy adopted by the Americans has not changed yet, explaining that the U.S. President Barack Obama's submission to the pressures and lies of the Zionist entity's prime minister concerning Iran indicates the weakness of the intellectual and political independence of the American president, and how powerful and mightful the influence of the U.S. Zionist lobby is. And now over to the final item with my colleague Rashid.
Thank you, Basim. Let's go to Afghanistan now. Afghani sources have confirmed the killing of 5 civilians, including 3 children, in a NATO raid yesterday on Nangarhar province, east of Afghanistan. On its part, the NATO, and as usual, after committing crimes against the Afghani civilians, tried to absorb the citizens' anger by announcing its intention to conduct an investigation of the incident, claiming that it has not known of the civilians being killed, a claim repeated after each raid.
With that last item, ladies and gentlemen, we conclude our news for tonight. Thank you very much for your kind listening. Damascus Radio presents News and Views.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Having confused over the explosions of Rihaniya and Bab al-Hawa and the innocent casualties that fell martyrs in Turkey, the organizations of Islamic State in Iraq and Asham threatened of launching a series of suicidal attacks which shall reach Ankara and Istanbul. In a letter, the terrorist organization said that their boots are almost approximating the Islamic land in the Turks' country. They intended to spread the heavenly message and they aim at purifying the Turks' lands from the blasphemous. As a result, the Turkish government shut down the crossing points now that the terrorism has reached the entrances of their country. Worth noting here, the Turkish government has already dispatched thousands of terrorists into the Syrian lands. Therefore, this can be branded as a backtrap for the terrorists into the Turkish lands. The Turkish Premier Erdogan, with his promise, short-sightedness and recklessness, did not expect this result after he had made decisions to interfere in the Syrian affairs. He even supplied the terrorists with sanctuary and training. As for the state of gas and oil, they invested their money in terrorism, and they paid for murdering the Syrian people. However, they will earn only coming calamities, while the money shall be blown away by the winds. The war against terrorism is not only Syrian, so long as the terrorists will turn back to the countries from which they have originally came. They must go through the state that they came from, so terrorism will not spare the Gulf states how much money they paid. On its part, Syria shall never relinquish its right of preserving its land's integrity, adopting all possible means in order to deter the aggression and boot out the terrorists.
That was news and views from Damascus Radio. Damascus Radio presents Syrian Local Press Review.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. The papers published in Damascus today highlighted the following headlines and items of news. The Turkish TV channel Khalq and Turkish paper Yurt interviewed President Bashar al-Assad. The president says that Turkey shall pay a high price for supporting terrorists in Syria. He adds that Turkish Premier Erdogan does not know honesty while his mind is sealed, narrow and fanatic. His Excellency also says that Erdogan, along with some members in his government, are all involved with shading the Syrian blood. Attempts of infiltration for mercenaries from Turkey and Lebanon are reported. On the other hand, the Syrian army forces control buildings in the quarter of Berzi and eliminating big numbers of terrorists who belong to al-Nusra Front. They also destroyed a cache for weaponry as well as vehicles and equipment in the countryside of Damascus, Aleppo, Idlib and Homs. Russia confirms that the contents of resolution number 200 or 2011 and 8 called for adopting the measures necessary to ban the opposition from controlling the chemical weapons. The Kremlin says that the crisis in Syria is in need for a Russian-American dialogue on the highest level. The steps taken by the American intelligence are the theme of today's editorial in Thora Daily. The paper says that the information leaked from the CIA on training the terrorists terrorists at this time indicates what the U.S. bears in mind, especially pertaining to the Middle East region. On the other side of the coin, the Saudi insistence on continuing support of terrorists exposes some secrets, namely the American marriage to terrorist organizations with the production, training, and planning. According, the Americans lied about the chemical issue, and they lie in politicals, and they are the same who are simply hypocrites in combating terrorism, which is made and produced by the U.S. itself, the paper concludes.
That was a review of the Syrian local press issued in Damascus this morning. You're listening to Damascus Radio, the broadcasting service of the Syrian Arab Republic. Before we sign off the national anthem, here is a final look at the news summary. Our people in Syria and Egypt are preparing for commemorating the 40th anniversary of the October War of Liberation. The Kremlin expresses regret that the Russian-US meeting between both countries' presidents will not happen. Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Jawad Zarif stresses Iran's readiness to continue cooperation that is aimed at reaching a political solution to the crisis in Syria. The Russian Foreign Ministry affirms that the jihadist groups fighting in Syria are linked to international terrorism. Russian diplomatic sources say that the chemical weapons attack in Damascus suburbs was done by a Saudi-black operations team. Members of the Syrian community in Russia reiterate full support of motherland Syria and their leadership. American Secretary of State John Kerry warns that the current financial crisis the U.S. is witnessing currently might weaken the position of the U.S. worldwide. And the Israeli enemy renews its violation of the Lebanese sovereignty in South Lebanon by a hostile reconnaissance plane. With that, ladies and gentlemen, we come to the end of our transmission for tonight. Until we meet again tomorrow at the same time and on the same frequencies, we wish you all the best from Damascus Radio, the broadcasting service of the Syrian Arab Republic. Good night.